after that.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Leah. I am the WebEx producer, and I will be in the background answering any WebEx technical questions. As an attendee, you will be in a listen-only mode throughout the presentation, and as being part of a larger audience, the attendee list is not displayed due to privacy concerns. And to note, today's event is being recorded. Today's presentation will be displayed in full screen mode. If you experience difficulties using the WebEx session, you may contact WebEx technical support at 1-866-229-3239 or use the Q&A box, and I will do my best to assist you. Questions for our presenters will be answered at the end of the presentation, but we do encourage you to ask questions any time throughout the presentation by again using the Q&A panel. To access the Q&A box, hover over the green floating toolbar on your screen, select the question mark icon, type into the text box, and send. Please choose all panelists in the Send To list, or your question may not be addressed. With that said, I would like to now introduce Lindsay Nichols, who will be leading today's presentation. Lindsay, please begin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second Impact Call. As mentioned, my name is Lindsay Nichols, and I'm thrilled to moderate today's discussion. For those of you new to this type of call, this is our attempt to evolve the definition of transparency and get you GuideStar's results in a more timely and comprehensive manner. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to briefly touch on the results of our last Impact Call in February. Really happy to note that some of you on the call today attended our last Impact Call, so thanks once again for joining us, and for those that are new, thanks for joining us as well. In addition to the more than 450 people who attended the first Impact Call in February, the Washington Post featured it, and there was a great dialogue about it on the GuideStar blog, and you can see some of those comments here. We learned a lot from your comments and even reframed our conversation a bit based on your guidance, so we'd love your thoughts once again. You can submit feedback about today's call at npo.gs/IC1Q2014. And I also want to note that our next Impact Call will be held on August 11th, again at 2 p.m. Eastern, so we'd love if you would go ahead and register to get it on your calendar, and that link is npo.gs/ImpactCall3. Okay, I have some quick housekeeping items, and then we can get started. First, we're live tweeting during today's presentation using the hashtag GSImpactCall, so we hope you join our conversation on Twitter. And secondly, we're going to take questions from you before and after. If we don't get to all of your questions, we have answers for you on the GuideStar blog at trust.guidestar.org soon. And finally, we will send all of you an email with today's PowerPoint and a recording of this live presentation in a few days. So I'm thrilled to introduce Jacob Harold, GuideStar's President and CEO, and James Lum, our CFO. And as I just mentioned, we're going to be taking questions after the call. If we don't have the ability to get to all of them, we certainly would like to respond to them later, but we absolutely want to take as many questions as we can. So we're actually going to leave half of our time to respond to your questions. So please do use that chat box. So Jacob, it's all yours.
Terrific. Thanks a lot, Lindsay, and welcome all to this second Impact Call. We are really pleased with how the first one went, and hopefully today will be useful for you, and as the last one was, useful for us as a mechanism for us to systematically get feedback from our stakeholders, from our users, our funders, the nonprofits that provide us data, and the broader GuideStar community. I wanted to start with one broad thought before I dive into the actual results. Now, this image that you see here on the screen is a schematic of the information flow in the nonprofit sector and how it flows from many different sources into GuideStar. We try and organize it, and it's used by many different user groups. And I show you this partly to show you that it's pretty complicated. And it's taken us 19.5 years to build what we've built so far. And we expect that it will be many more years until we've truly realized our vision of a nonprofit sector that is capable of tackling the great challenges of our time, whether that's climate change or poverty or the achievement gap in education, and that whatever role we can play in helping to build that system, that we will feel satisfied with what we've done. And I say that because this is a quarterly Impact Call, 4 times a year. And yet we're talking about building something that has already taken 19 years and might take another 19. And that as Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe is long. He said it bends towards justice, which I believe, but we have to keep in mind that making a better world takes a long time. And I say all of that because we want to make sure that by having a quarterly impact call, that we are not reinforcing short-termism. We are not saying that change happens quickly. What we're trying to do here is to provide systematic, regular updates about the single steps that we're taking towards that much longer-term goal. And we've seen in the private sector quarterly earnings calls be a very useful feedback mechanism, but at times they've contributed to a sense of short-termism on Wall Street. And we want to move in the exact opposite direction, a direction that is really clear and open about the short-term steps that we're taking towards very, very long-term goals. So with that, let me move on to my section on programmatic and operational results for GuideStar in the first quarter of 2014. Let me just start by saying that we had a number of product launches and new partnerships that happened in the first quarter, most notably the release of a portfolio of APIs. Now, APIs are application programming interfaces. They're the way that one database can talk to another database, or one website talk to another website, without requiring a person to mediate directly. And this is a way for our data to show up on other platforms more easily, quickly, and cheaply. We're also proud to launch a partnership with BoardSource, the experts in nonprofit governance, and we took their input to change how we gather information about how nonprofits work with their boards. And we were pleased to see, for example, the cover story on Advancing Philanthropy, the magazine of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, was about the Overhead Myth campaign that we launched with Charity Navigator and the Better Business Bureau Wise Giving Alliance. So it's been a great quarter for us in terms of our continued attempt to push forward the conversation in the field and offer new tools for our users. Now here on the next slide, I just wanted to mention these are the 20 annual objectives that we have set for 2014. And it's worth noting these are slightly tweaked from the ones we showed you last time. We showed you 18 objectives. We've tweaked one and added 2 more. And so we generally feel that the broader strategy that we've set in place for 2014 is pretty stable, but we have had to make some shifts along the way, just as we expected. Now, on this next slide, which is probably the one that in some ways I'm most proud of in this whole presentation, this is a sample of pages from what we're calling GuideStar 2020, which is our strategic plan, which is for the next 3 years, but really looks forward all the way to 2020, and which is in a nice alignment, aligned with this fall, which will be GuideStar's 20th anniversary. This particular document is not yet publicly available. This is the private version, but we are right now in the midst of tweaking it so that we can have a publicly available version, which we will be sharing with all of you and all of our other stakeholders, to show what it is that we have in store over the next several years, what we think we're going to need from our community to help make it happen, and why we believe it's actually possible. And I will just take a minute to note here just how good this document looks. I think you can see here the benefits that we've already reaped from bringing on a world-class graphic designer onto our staff.
Jacob, this is Lindsay. I'm noting that even though you have changed the slides on your computer, that the rest of us can't see it. So hopefully it'll catch up any moment. But again, we will be sending this presentation to everyone after the fact. So hopefully it'll catch up any minute. Sorry about that, everyone.
Should we shift it over to Cody?
That'd be great.
Yeah, it seems that we're stuck on one of our slides, I think slide number 8 right now, and it's not advancing. So can we shift over to Cody as the presenter? it is. All right.
Okay, Cody, if you can go ahead and share your desktop, please.
All right, so it seems that it's now advanced on to slide number 9, so thank you, Cody, for that. We can move on to slide number 10. So speaking of GuideStar's staff, as is so often true in the nonprofit sector, our biggest cost by far is the cost of staff. And as we think about all the things that we want to do going forward that are laid out in the strategic plan that we'll soon be sharing with you all, the fundamental additional cost that we face is going to be in staff. And you can just see in this graphic representation here, our staff color-coded by department on the left-hand side right now, and on the right-hand side where we think we're going to need to be in a couple of years with the white boxes representing new staff. So I will say for anyone who's looking for a new job, keep an eye out on GuideStar's website because we will be having some new roles opening to help advance this broader mission that we have. All right, let's move on to some of the quantitative programmatic results. Onto the next slide, slide number 11. So if you can kind of pull open all these, yeah, there we go, thank you. So on the left-hand side here, you see GuideStar's old organizational dashboard. Now, as a data-driven organization, it's very important that we thoughtfully aggregate the different numbers that represent the work that we do. But we had actually kind of overwhelmed ourselves with numbers. And so we've gone through a process recently led by our head of strategy, Ms. Munkusairi, to bring in our focus onto fewer metrics with clearer targets, and to make a tool that was more useful to the management team here in making decisions. And that's the evolution that you see here on the right with a few of the key metrics with stars beside them. Cody, if you could move to the next slide, please. Now, notably, this is what we call an organizational dashboard, and by that we mean it is internally oriented to help our own decision-making processes. This is not meant to be an externally oriented document, although we're happy to share it as appropriate. And I'll talk in a minute about a companion document that offers longer-term evidence of our success, and maybe at times our failures. But for right now, let me just focus on a couple categories of metrics within this organizational dashboard. So Cody, on to the next slide, please. Now, this is a set of what we call engagement metrics. These are metrics that give us a sense of our progress in engaging the attention of the nonprofit community, and most notably, the participation of nonprofits in the GuideStar exchange mechanism, which is our primary tool for gathering information directly from nonprofits. A couple of things I'll highlight here. So first is you'll see at the top row, we have the total number of organizations that have participated. We are quite close to that magical 100,000 mark. And we're particularly thrilled to see, just in the last quarter that we've had more than 11% growth in that total participation. That's the kind of growth that actually could get us to our goal of reaching 200,000 by the end of our strategic plan at the end of 2016. Now, that said, it's going to take a lot of work for us to maintain that growth rate, but we're quite pleased with that. And then, within the different categories of participation, there are various levels, and I'll highlight that we have had the fastest growth in our gold level, which includes not just updated information about a nonprofit's operations and its finances, but also structured information about its programmatic goals and strategies and measurement systems. And we've seen much faster growth over the last quarter, almost 40%. Now, that's over a lower base, and we have a lot of growth that we want to see at that gold level. But it's indicative to us that we hope, be able to maintain this general high rate of growth. Now, there's not just participation, but there's also the freshness of the data itself, and that's the bottom row here, the profile update ratio, which is a measure of how often nonprofits or how recently nonprofits have updated their profiles. We've seen a slight increase there, but we also recognize we have a bit of work to maintain that going forward. So let's move on now to the next slide, which is another category of these programmatic metrics, and they relate to just the broader category that we call products, which is all the tools that we build for people to use and to get access to our data. We're generally pleased that we are continuing to have about 50,000 additional registered users coming to our site. But that number has dropped just a little bit. If you see the year-over-year rate, I think that's just natural variance. I don't think there's any signal in that noise, but that's something we're going to have to keep our eye on going forward. On the second row there, you have the number of API hits, and as I mentioned before, this is the mechanism whereby our data is used on other websites, not just on GuideStar.org. And in the long run, we believe that this is going to be perhaps the most important channel for getting good data about nonprofits to users across the nonprofit sector, not through our website, but through others. And so we're especially pleased to see that high growth rate there. On the final row here, a number of customers, you'll see there the not applicable. That's not because we didn't have customers before, it's because we've been changing how it is that we count customers. And by customers here, we do mean people who pay GuideStar for access to our premium tools or mechanisms of analysis, et cetera. And one of our most tricky challenges as an organization is to figure out how do we have these 3,000 to 4,000 organizations and individuals help to subsidize the other 7 million users who use GuideStar for free. So that's something that we're going to want to return to in future quarters and talk to you about how our customer base is evolving and how we can make sure that that customer base, A, is satisfied and gets real value out of GuideStar's products and services, but B, continues to make the economics work so that we can continue to offer the data for free to the majority of our users. On to the next slide, please. And I'll just cite that, as I mentioned, the metrics that I've just shared very much fall in this organizational dashboard category. These are primarily internal metrics that we use to help us make decisions on a monthly, quarterly, weekly basis to make sure we're heading in the right direction. But they are, in the nomenclature of nonprofit evaluation, they're mostly outputs, they're not outcomes. So they may demonstrate activity that we've been involved in, they may demonstrate use of our data, but they don't yet demonstrate that we've achieved our mission. And that is questions more like, are people actually making better decisions? Is money better allocated? Are nonprofits learning from each other? And these are ultimately far more important questions, but they're also much harder to measure. So I just want to flag here that we have a parallel dashboard that we're evaluating that we're calling the evaluation dashboard that is meant to get to these bigger, harder, ultimately more important questions about how all the stuff that we do, what does it really mean? How does it matter for the world? And so in a future impact call, we should have that evaluation dashboard ready to share with you as well. And with that, let me hand it over to James to talk about our financial results.
Great, thank you, Jacob. You can go to the next slide. And the next one. So first, two quick notes for everyone. For the most part, current year numbers are preliminary and are unaudited, and our historical results are not necessarily indicative of future results, and all forward-looking statements contain, of course, known and unknown risks that may result in future results that are materially different from our historical results. Next slide. I wanted to start off the financial discussion with a quick recap of our last Impact Calls results, which were about our year-end results. And first, I'll touch on our top-line results, then I'll go into the Q1 results and also in greater detail after that. On this first slide here, you see our revenue and expenses over the last 4 years. And you see a trend, obviously, in revenue, which is we recovered from the 2009 and 2010 recession. We restored our revenue to prior year levels, and we pretty much kept them flat at or around $11.2 million over the last 3 years, ending in 2013. Expenses spiked in 2011, and since then we've brought them down by about $1.6 million. Okay, if you can go to the next slide, we'll talk about our bottom line results over the last 4 years. And here you have cash flow and GAAP operating income, which is change in unrestricted net assets. And we have pretty good progress on both cash flow and operating income. In 2010, we had almost negative cash flow of almost $1.3 million. We turned that around by $2 million over the last 3 years, finishing with $850,000 last year, and GAAP operating income tracked very closely to that with another $1.9 million improvement over 4 years. If you can look at the next slide, we'll look at our Q1 results. Now these are in marked contrast to the annual results we had last time. You have revenue taking a slide from $3.3 million in Q1 of 2013, and coming in at only $2.4 million this first quarter, and expenses going up by almost over $300,000 from $2.4 million to $2.7 million. And if you can go to the next slide, we'll look at our bottom line results in Q1. Cash flow and GAAP operating income also taking a negative direction. We have a $1.1 million change in cash flow from $500,000 positive in Q1 of last year, and a loss of $700,000 Q1 of this year, and operating income going from $900,000 last year to over $300,000 loss this quarter. If you go to the next slide here, Cody, well, timing is everything, apparently, when it comes to results. At first glance, without appropriate context, our Q1 financial performance appears to be cause for concern. However, it turns out that timing is everything, and underlying performance for GuideStar was much better this quarter when you consider it with all the relevant facts. Timing was especially important in the following areas. Timing was important when it came to the timing of grants, when it came to revenue. Timing was important when it came to expenses, and the timing of our personnel expenses and the growth in that over the last year. And timing was very important when it came to bottom line cash flow and operating results, and the relative timing of revenue versus expenses. So I'll go into detail on each of these in a second, but this kind of raises the interesting question of timing and how it relates to nonprofits overall. As Jacob was talking about, reporting on a quarterly basis could lead to short-termism. In other words, instead of looking over the long view at performance results and using that as guidance for performance and management decisions, you could be focused only on year-over-year quarterly results and get into gamesmanship as far as timing of revenue or postponing expenses just to produce good quarterly results. You can see that we didn't really pay much attention to that this quarter in that sense. We did not base our decisions just on delivering good quarterly results. We made decisions based on the long view, because in the end, both the short-term view and the long-term view is important, because short-term results build up to your long-term results, and long-term goals should be guiding your short-term decisions. Okay. Now I'll go into the specifics of how timing affected our revenue and expenses on the next slide. This slide is a comparison of revenue this quarter, Q1 2014 versus the prior year. And at the bottom you see in blue and green and in purple the majority of our revenue, which was actually up $100,000 year over year. 2.4 million versus 2.3 million last year, excluding grants. Now there's another million in grants that we received last Q1, whereas this year we only received $50,000 in grants. And that's really a factor of timing. Some of that money was paid in Q1 of last year, but it's going to come in Q2 of this year, and some of them represent the expiration of certain multi-year grants. So our baseline business, which is products, membership, and other small things, pretty much remained steady and grew a couple of percentage points over last year. But the big variable number, which is grants, which accounts for 12 to 15% of our revenue on an annual basis, that constantly moves up and down and throughout the year. So this is why timing was important for revenue. If you look at the next slide, you'll see the same thing kind of happening in expenses. So the red bars up at the top represent personnel costs, both salary and benefits, as well as consultants that we bring in to help us do a lot of the projects that we're working on. That's where the majority of the change occurred in our quarter-over-quarter expenses. They basically only went up $30,000, excluding staff and consulting. But they went up, the rest of the difference, the $350,000, is all in the red bar, the staffing. And that increase accounted for 90% of our operating expense increases over the year. And on the right-hand side, in that blue box, you see the key investments that we made in personnel over the last year. We hired a senior director of products where we had no one single person who was in charge of products before. We hired a director of strategy where we had no person who was in charge of strategy before. We hired a development director where for the last year and a half, we did not have a full-time person who was just in charge of fundraising through grants. And then we also built out some key strategic areas, additional personnel in business intelligence, additional personnel in sales and support, and additional software engineers to help create our products. Now, a lot of that investment occurred towards the end of last year. So this year, they're counted as part of our expenses. Last year, they were not part of those expenses. So over the course of the year, we're going to catch up on those expenses in a year-over-year comparison, but that won't take place until the tail end of the year. The next couple of quarters, we're going to have additional staff in 2014 numbers compared to 2013 numbers that did not have them. But the gap will gradually narrow by the end of the year until we're pretty much on an apples-to-apples basis. Okay? So from these two things, you can see how revenue and expenses, how important the timing is for that. And the two of those combined is what created our bottom line results. You can go to the next slide. Looking forwards into Q2, revenue for us here at GuideStar is generally stronger than in Q2 than in Q1 on a seasonal basis. So we'll have some lift in product sales in the second quarter. A lot of the grant timing from the Q1 is going to flow into Q2, so that's going to make Q2 results also stronger. And last year, we didn't have any additional grants after that $1 million in March, all the way from April through August. So any grants that we get this year is going to help our Q2 comps. Now, that's not exactly how we're managing or the direction that we're trying to manage things, but it does explain the results, the short-term versus the long-term view. Expenses, the run rates are going to plateau because we're not going to be adding new people at the same rate that we did last year. They're going to remain steady, but the year-over-year comparisons, that gap is going to shrink as the people that we added last year catch up. Okay? So Q2 outlook is going to be looking pretty good because expenses are going to moderate and revenue is going to increase. Maybe to go to the next slide, I'll close with the same thought I opened with, which is that timing is everything. In this case, timing is everything when it comes to transparency. I'd like to announce to everyone that we just wrapped up our annual audit, and we had a clean auditor's opinion. And like many of you on the phone today, we're going to be following our 2013 990 later this week on Thursday, the 15th. And I'd like to underscore that we've already reported our year-end results 3 months ago. And that was 45 days after year-end. Right now, we're giving you our Q1 results. And the IRS doesn't even have our official year-end numbers yet. And it's very likely that we'll be reporting our Q2 numbers to you before the IRS releases our 990. There's even the possibility that we're going to lap them before they ever get around to getting it out. So the question is this kind of timing good enough for meaningful discussions of programmatic and financial results in the nonprofit sector? We found anecdotally that 75% of nonprofits exercise the 3-month filing extension in addition to the 5-month filing deadline, which makes it 8 months before the IRS receives year-end numbers and even more time before it actually makes it to the public. So while this 990 is sufficient for its own narrow purpose, which is an IRS purpose, the question is this sufficient for the nonprofit sector's transparency needs? In short, I don't believe the 990 is sufficient, and that timing is everything when it comes to transparency. Without greater timeliness in transparency information, there can't be a meaningful discussion about the important issues in our sector. We'll just be living in the past, and we're not going to be, not even the present, and certainly not talking about the future. So timing is everything. And with that, I'll hand it over to Lindsay for our question and answer session.
Great. So we have a bunch of questions. Let's dive in. First question, regarding the number of API hits, what does API stand for? And I think, what do the hits stand for?
Yes. So API is, again, Application Programming Interface. And again, you can think of it as a window that connects two rooms. You know, one room has data, say in GuideStar's database, and how do we get that data into another room that's being used by another website? And GuideStar's data shows up on a lot of other websites. Amazon.com, the National Donor Advised Funds of major institutions like Fidelity, partner organizations like Network for Good and others. And we think that's a critical part of our strategy for distributing information, but it has to get there somehow. And there are actually a number of different technologies that are used to share that information. So one technology is just that we send a partner organization a giant file with a whole bunch of data. And maybe we'll send them an update once a month in case anything's changed. And then they're able to use that information. APIs are a lighter weight and faster way of sharing information. And with an API, essentially the partner website calls up GuideStar's database and says, hey, I need this information, and GuideStar's database sends it right over. And that can all happen in the span of, you know, the blink of an eye. And so the numbers that we're reporting here are the number of times that's happened in the previous quarter, a bit over 7 million for us in the last quarter. And that's something that, you know, we could imagine having 10x or more growth over time.
Great. So Michelle Bart, who is president and co-founder of the National Women's Coalition Against Violence and Exploitation, has a question, but I also wanted to say she submitted a comment that she completely agrees with the IRS delay. So we are talking to the choir here. Her question is there a place we can learn more about how to use the NTEE categories?
So for anyone who doesn't know, NTEE is the National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities. And what that is it's just a way of dividing up the nonprofit sector into different categories. And it was developed in partnership between the IRS and the Urban Institute, and GuideStar and many others use it. And there are some things about that taxonomy that are not perfect, but it is one of the most important ways that we can make sense of the nonprofit sector, which, as most of you know, involves more than 1 million organizations in the U.S. And, you know, the NTEE codes break down the sector into categories like education or healthcare or the arts. There are a couple sources that you could look at for more information. There's quite a bit on the IRS website, on the Urban Institute's website, and there is some on GuideStar's as well. So a Google search for NTEE, and again, that's National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities, and by exempt they mean tax exempt. If you did a Google search for that and additional information or analysis or those sort of keywords, you would come up with these resources across the IRS, Urban Institute, and GuideStar.
And to that end, I actually just created a short link for Michelle and others. So for that page on our website, it's npo.gs/NTEE codes. So you can learn more there. So Rachel Mosher-Williams, who is the principal at RMW Consulting, asks, what did you use to build your organizational dashboard? Does it function as an interactive tool for staff?
So that's a great question, Rachel. And actually, our colleague, Ms. Munkusairi, is on the phone. So if I might actually ask her to answer that question if we can pull her. She's with us live from the West Coast. Ms., are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Great. Thanks for that. Thanks for the question. We are currently using Excel to build the dashboard, and we are definitely hoping that over time it will be more automated and interactive for staff. But as we are continuing to improve our processes, this is something that we're being mindful of, but in the current moment, it's a pretty manual process using Excel.
That's right, and you know, that's functional for us right now, but it is something, as Ms. says, that we're exploring, you know, other tools down the road. And I will say that we are sharing that through an internal intranet based on the Igloo software so that all staff have access to that dashboard. And we are looking to link it to our CRM systems and our accounting systems and others. But right now we are relying on the hard work of Ms. and her team to make that a useful document for GuideStar.
I'll also add that the dashboard itself is the tip of the iceberg as far as internal metrics that we might be looking at. So the degree of automation and availability is, you know, either higher or lower in specific pockets, lower down in the organization. So we have a lot more real-time data that's available in certain cases than in others. But to bring them all together is another issue, and that's why we have to rely on Excel.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Great. Another question. This is from Peter, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce your last name, but he is president of Mast Associates. He asks, do you list all of the GuideStar Exchange participants, and what information is available about how being a participant affects donations to these charities?
So we don't have, that I know of at least, on our website a single list of all 96,000 participating organizations, or at least contributing organizations. But it is possible through the GuideStar public report page to see if an individual organization has reached one of the 3 levels, gold, silver, and bronze, as, you know, I'd have to check the number, but about 40,000 have. I'm actually pulling up the presentation that I just gave to remember what the exact number is. It is, 39,000 about. Now, in terms of how that influences donations, we do not yet have concrete data on that. That's a very hard question to answer from a social science perspective. But there are a few things that we do know. We do know that we have 7.2 million people using our site every year, plus the 22+ million API hits that I mentioned, plus other uses of our data. And we also know that research by Hope Consulting has shown that 85+% of donors believe that nonprofit performance is important, and about 30% do some research. A lot of them are doing that on GuideStar's site. And that when they ask what sort of information they're looking for, they tend to look for the kinds of information that you find through GuideStar Exchange, which is to say basic legitimacy information, financial data, and then most importantly, programmatic and impact data. So we can't answer that question directly because we don't have the perfect evidence to say, well, it increases your fundraising by 12.5%. Maybe someday we'll be able to answer the question with that degree of detail, but right now we have to rely on this cluster of related kinds of data that we think when you add them all up, they do show that it is very much worth the time of a nonprofit to follow their 96,000 fellow travelers and to keep their GuideStar Exchange profile updated.
And this is Lindsay. We just have a really good case study from the Stuttering Foundation. So if you go to our website on the GuideStar Exchange page, we actually have featured how she says, Jane Fraser, who's the president there, she said that being a GuideStar Exchange participant actually helped her fundraise. So there's some good evidence anecdotally as well. Okay, so this is a good question. Connie, again, not going to try to pronounce the last name, Executive Director of Families Together, asks, one of the community foundations that we work with says that we have to update our information on their site because there is not a two-way sharing between GuideStar and their site. Will this be better now?
Well, I mean, it depends on where you are and whether or not that community foundation is part of the Donor Edge network. So there are 16 community foundations that partner with GuideStar through something called Donor Edge. These include everyone from Boston to Middle Tennessee to Central Florida to Sacramento. And these community foundations have a close partnership with GuideStar so that you only have to fill out the data once. And we are doing our very best to bring in more community foundations into that partnership. But it does require that kind of intentionality. Now, one thing I will say is that I mentioned the release of these APIs. They make it a lot easier for example, say a very small community foundation that didn't feel like it had the resources to implement an entire new software program, in this case Donor Edge, to be able to use our APIs to integrate something that they already had, et cetera. So we are working to make that easier, but we really do also have to count on the help and engagement of community foundations. And one thing I will say is that we recently lowered the prices for the Donor Edge platform that we offer quite significantly. We're really trying to put that in the reach of as many community foundations as possible while maintaining our own financial viability.
Great. Someone said, can you better explain the nonprofit update percentage and what a goal or ideal would be? So Cody, if you can actually take us back to that slide.
Yeah, that's a good point, and especially because I did not do a very good job of explaining it. And Lindsay may have to help me on the specifics here, but I believe it is the number, the numerator in the ratio is the number of GuideStar Exchange participants who updated their profile in the last month.
Right.
And the denominator is the total number of GuideStar Exchange participants.
That's right. And it is an organization that has updated any section of their GuideStar Exchange profile. So it doesn't necessarily mean they're moving up the levels. It just means that they've actually given us more information, which is really what we're seeking for here. We want more information. And I will thank Ms. for explaining that better to me this morning so that I have the answer correctly. So good question. So someone said, can you provide general information on legitimacy information and its interference with the IRS, specifically as it relates to the revocation of nonprofit status? So I think this is more for you, James, but it's all about the legitimacy.
Can you repeat it again? Because I think that has multiple parts.
Can you provide general information on the legitimacy information and its interference with IRS, specifically as it relates to the revocation of nonprofit status?
I'm going to do my best to answer this question, and I'm afraid that I may not answer what the asker meant specifically. So if they'd like to follow up later on, we can clarify. But when we look at legitimacy of nonprofit organizations, we're talking in our minds at GuideStar about whether or not they have passed the tests as far as the IRS is concerned for their 501c3 status. So that basically boils down to two things, whether they're on the Pub 78 document and whether they're registered in the BMF, Business Master File. So they're kind of two technical requirements that go hand in hand with each other. Now, it would be nice if the government updated both of those information sources in similar fashion and similar timing, but it doesn't always happen. So if you're on the grants administration side of things, then it kind of falls upon you to look in both of those places and check on the current status of any organization that you intend to fund. And that can be complicated and difficult if you have a large number of organizations that you're issuing funds to. So what GuideStar does is we update that from both of those information sources on a daily basis and then make that data available through our Charity Check product. It is at additional cost. It's a paid product, but it does address both of those questions. And then, of course, if an organization fails to meet those requirements, it'll have its nonprofit status revoked, which is the other part of the person's question, and then that will be reflected in our Charity Check database as soon as that information is made available in the data sources that the IRS provides.
Great. Love it. Wayne Clark, who is the creative director of My Time Inc., asks, we are 7 years into the nonprofit business. How long does it take for donors to look at your organization? Great question.
Yeah, and you know, the answer is it ranges from one day to never, unfortunately. But you know, in a world where we have, as I've said earlier, more than 1 million nonprofits, rising above the din is not an easy thing. And in a way it shouldn't be, because we want to help to build excellence in the field. And we want not just any organization to be able to get the attention of donors, but the very best organizations to get the attention of donors. Our challenge is, how do we have a small organization that's no one's heard of that's truly excellent? How do we help them rise above the din? And perhaps your organization is one of those. And so, you know, this gets to a question for marketers, communication specialists, fundraising specialists. What we know at GuideStar is that we want to provide a neutral platform, an objective platform that will allow an organization that's truly excellent to tell their story in a way that puts them on equal footing with the billion-dollar nonprofits of the world, with the Red Cross and the American Heart Association, with the Nature Conservancy or the NAACP, and to be able to say, well, look, you can see I'm answering the same questions. My finances are presented in the same way. My programmatic work is presented in the same way, and you can make a judgment based on that. But that said, there is no single time when donors start to notice a given organization. And you know, every organization faces their own community, their own stakeholders, and their own unique challenges in telling their own story.
Great. We have a question from Anthony, just came in through Twitter. How do we get more information on religious organizations that aren't required to provide information to the IRS?
Well, let me just say that this is very much on the top of our mind right now. The head of research at GuideStar, Chuck McLean, and I recently met with someone at the National Conference of Catholic Bishops around this exact question. Now, the truth is that religious organizations are not required to file under the same set of restrictions that other kinds of nonprofits are. And many people argue that that's for very good reasons of religious freedom. There's certainly controversy around that. Our strategy is to go to individual denominations that have often aggregated the many nonprofits that fall under the category of Reform Judaism or the Catholic Church or Hinduism, whatever the religious body may be that has aggregated these institutions, and then to get that information from them and integrate it into GuideStar. That is a pretty heavy lift. It requires a lot of attention on our part and a lot of time working with individual denominations to help convince them that it's in their interest and the interest of the field to share this information. Because as of right now, there's no way for us to get that from the government. So it's something we hope to do, and we're working on it, but it may take a while until we're able to do that comprehensively.
Great. Really interesting question. What can the sector expect from GuideStar in the next 5 years?
Ooh, go for it.
All right. Well, let me tell you that whoever asked that question, I hope that you'll enjoy reading the GuideStar 2020 strategic plan that I mentioned once we have a public version of it, because it lays it out in great detail, and there's 18 specific strategies within that. But there are a few things that I'll highlight. One is I would expect to see much greater scale for GuideStar, that we're going to be going from 7 million users a year to, say, 20 million. That we're going to go from having, depending on how you count, about 100 partners who are using our APIs and similar mechanisms on their own sites to more like 500. That we're going to go from having about 40,000 nonprofits that have reached at least the bronze level of participation in the GuideStar Exchange to 200,000. So you'll see more scale. The second thing is that you're going to see more contextual data. So data not just about nonprofits themselves, but about the organizations that fund nonprofits, about social science research on what works to address a problem or an opportunity that a nonprofit sees. contextual data. So for example, that you would see on the page of a literacy organization in Chicago, you'd see the literacy rate in Chicago. You're going to see more attention to graphic design and visualization as we recognize that the sheer scale of data that we have is pretty overwhelming, not just to our users, but sometimes to us, and that we have to figure out how to visualize that. And then I believe that you will see the GuideStar Exchange serving as the common profile in the nonprofit sector, serving as the place that nonprofits tell their story in a comparable way. We're already well on our way to that, but I think you'll see that solidified and eventually to a point where it's auto-populating every major platform in the nonprofit sector. Then there are a number of other kinds of innovation that we're going to be building on top of what I've just mentioned, but those are the key things that I would expect to see. More scale, more context, more visualization, and the GuideStar Exchange as a common profile for the whole field.
Great. When it comes to the organizational dashboard, how did you decide which metrics were most relevant?
Great question. I might actually hand this one over to Ms.
Thanks, Jacob. We have started from a long history of collecting numerous data points, as Jacob showed in the evolution. We did engage Hope Consulting in a review of the existing metrics that we had been collecting in the past, and there's, as James had alluded to, numerous departmental metrics that we had and continue to track. We also surveyed and interviewed some of our key external stakeholders, our board, various donors, on what information would be important and relevant for us, both from a making our internal decisions, which is the focus of the organizational dashboard, and also just our entire metrics and monitoring and evaluation processes overall. And so this is certainly something that we're implementing in stages, and the first version of the organizational dashboard we had presented to our board 2 weeks ago. We started with 20 metrics, and now version 2, which we're working on this quarter, is reduced to 10 metrics, which is a work in progress, and over time, towards the end of this year, we're going to be starting to tackle some of those broader, longer-term, more difficult outcome-related questions and answers in the impact evaluation dashboard that Jacob referenced. So it's you know, with the guidance and help from a lot of smart people on our board, our external donors, and certainly we welcome, you know, once we post the dashboard and you all take a look at it, we'd love to get your thoughts and feedback on what are the other metrics that you have been tracking at your organization and any thoughts and suggestions that you might have for us.
Great, and to that point, I want to give that URL again. We'd love to hear from you about particularly this dashboard. So that link is NPO, N as in Nancy, npo.gs/IC1Q2014. Another question, what are the benefits of using GuideStar versus Charity Navigator?
Sure, well, I'll speak to this and let anyone else add. You know, Charity Navigator is a partner organization of ours, and we've worked with them before. The two organizations are quite different. There are, the most fundamental distinction is that Charity Navigator rates organizations and GuideStar does not. We see ourselves as a neutral platform where people can make their own decisions. The various levels of the GuideStar Exchange program, bronze, silver, and gold, they're not judgments per se on a nonprofit. They are indications that an organization has been willing to share certain categories of information. Whereas Charity Navigator is saying that a 4-star charity, that's better than being a 3 or a 2-star organization. And those are different approaches. I think they're complementary. There have certainly been significant critiques about GuideStar's rating methodology. They are well on their way to, Charity Navigator's rating methodology, and Charity Navigator has been evolving that in significant ways and is improving it, but they know that they have a ways to go still. The other important distinction is that Charity Navigator has detailed information on about 6,000 organizations, whereas GuideStar has significant information about many hundreds of thousands. And so there is a difference in scale there. There are other differences as well, but I think that's the primary distinction. There's more depth on GuideStar, a little bit less judgment, a little bit more comprehensiveness. But for certain users, Charity Navigator's very focused, rating-centered approach is more appropriate.
Great. We have about 4 minutes left, so we'll take just a few more questions. Judith Marshall, who is Vice President of Internal Affairs with Promise House, asks, do you feel that employees at lower organizational levels feel that their contributions are reflected in the metrics? And how did you get their input during the development process? And I think she's referring to the dashboard.
I mean, that's a great question. You know, I would say, you know, as much as we can, we try not to refer to lower and higher levels of the organization. You know, we do have an organizational hierarchy, and there are reporting structures, but you know, every member of the GuideStar team is an essential part of what we do, and we do really see ourselves as a family here. So we've done our best to loop in all of the staff in systematic ways. We have staff retreats twice a year. We have quarterly internal staff calls. We have, as I mentioned before, an intranet where we try and post early iterations of these sorts of documents to ensure that there are multiple opportunities for staff to participate. I think it's something we're still trying to figure out. Now, you know, Ms. mentioned about how we have these two different kinds of dashboards for different purposes. And even within the first one, the organizational dashboard, there's kind of the high-level organizational metrics, and then there are all these sub-metrics that are really more focused on particular departments that are often more relevant to the day-to-day work of an individual staff member. So it's a tricky thing for us to balance, but it is something we've done our best to engage the staff in a systematic way. And, you know, in some ways, ironically, that's easier when you have one or two people, in this case, Ms. And her colleague Anisha Singh, who are really driving the process, because there's time to make sure that other voices are heard. And it actually turns out that it takes real investment to bring in those voices from across the organization.
And I'll say one other thing, which is that the dashboard metrics are really rolled up metrics that you can also roll back down, and that what we're striving for is metrics that are not too granular and span multiple areas. So you're really rolling up performance from, you know, a bunch of different departments that all roll up into one. Now, when you find that that metric is off or of concern or, you know, spectacular, you want to go into details, that's when you roll it back down and go into the individual areas. So yes, the individual lower level, quote unquote, departments are vitally important, but the intent is to look at it at a higher level, rolled up level, at a judgmentally higher level, so that you can have wider ranging, actionable kinds of guidance.
Great. Very last question. GuideStar sounds like it's in the midst of some very big changes. How do you speak to funders when there's a lot of uncertainty?
So this is an ongoing tension for us, but it's a pretty productive kind of tension, I think. It's one where we're trying to build on the best of the past and maintain a sense of continuity for our users and for our funders that have, in many cases, been with us for a long time, while also evolving in significant ways. And I think it takes us constantly affirming both the past and the future and the importance that each has for GuideStar right now in the present. And I think that the document that I mentioned, which I'm currently waving in the air, no one can see this, but I'm so proud of it, I believe will, and it's quite a hot off the presses last week. Our hope is that it will give funders, who are a critical part of making GuideStar's economics work, a sense of confidence that even as we are evolving in significant ways, that the things that have made GuideStar, we believe, important to the field over the last 19.5 years are going to continue. And that we hope that we show in this document how to maintain that continuity. And, you know, as a closing thought, it gets to, you know, what James was talking about timing is everything. What I mentioned earlier about long-term time horizons. And it's really about us figuring out how do we have a quarterly cadence that is part of a much longer multi-decade story. And it's a challenge for all organizations, and it's one that we're doing our very best to address. And TBD if we succeed, but right now I'm feeling very, very positive.
It's a great final note to end on. So thank you so much, Jacob and James. And truly, thanks to all of you for participating and asking such thoughtful questions. If we didn't get to your question, check the GuideStar blog at trust.guidestar.org soon. And watch out for the email. It will come soon with the presentation and this live recording. And we hope we see you on our next Impact call on August 11th at 2 p.m. You can register at npo.gs/impact3, and I hope everybody has a great day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. You may now disconnect your lines. Have a great day.